Okay, so since it's 3 o'clock, I just let in Romano, SeeSee.
Good.
Romano helping us out with the channel as well. Hey, Romano. Just Romano, Betty Sue Romano. He is
Hi,
a
Romano.
Good
sort of
good
underpins.
morning or good evening.
And
I'm
you're
not
in
sure
Bangkok,
exactly
right?
what it is. Yes, ma'am, I'm in Bangkok right now.
Okay. Well, let's let everybody in and
Oh,
we can get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Hey, Nikki, nice to see you. And Yelena, nice to see you again. Hey, Julie, how's it going? We're just going to wait a minute and let folks trickle in and also get started because I know that we will have lots of ground to cover. Cece, is there a way to pin Betty Sue so that she's
yes. If you let Romano is great at that. If you could make him co-host.
I sure will, Romano.
Romano is great with Zoom. So we have a
Fantastic.
thank you.
Hey, Stephen. Hey, Kelly. All right, well, I'm going to get started. Welcome to the June session of the JFS Futures Studies Channel Community of Practice. Today we are so lucky to have Betty Sue Flowers with us. She is known globally for her work on scenarios with Shell and with so many other clients. She's had a long and illustrious career, and I've lost count of the number of folks in Europe and in Africa for whom it's 3 or 4 a.m. now. Stephen, I'm kind of looking at you thinking, what time is it? But who are excited to catch the recording. Betty Sue started out as a literature professor and a scholar of poetry. And then she became Shell's global scenarios editor, became the editor of the Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyer's book, which was a companion to the documentary The Power of Myth. She's the co-author of Presence, which is an exploration of profound change and transformation in people and society. She's the former director of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library and Museum in Texas and the author of the recently published and really great book for practitioners, Scenarios, Crafting and Using Stories of the Future to Change the Present, with a foreword by her. I think you work a lot with Adam. Is it Kahan?
I
Yeah.
say Kahane, but
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sure no, I'm sure originally it's Kahan because it's
Okay.
really yeah, but I
Adam
say
Kahan or
Kahane.
Kahane?
Kahane, yeah.
So, since this session is part of a Future Studies Channel series about the relationship between imagination and futures and foresight, I'll start with imagination and stories in your own life. So, people sometimes use imagination to mean kind of daydreaming, but as someone who has spent a lifetime thinking about storytelling, how do you define imagination?
I think of imagination as the thing that gets sparked by something that connects to your feeling. So I think it's the one area that AI can't do. Now, it looks like what AI can do includes imagination, but its kind of imagination is guessing what the next step will be. So I think in the future, whether it's with foresight or just in daily life, imagination is going to be a quality that will be in more demand because also imagination is sparked by conversation and by dialogue and by the things we observe when we're with each other that involves embodied spirits, so to speak, which is one of the great things about scenario practice. It's always done in groups. It's not an individual. I write poetry by myself, but scenarios, it's always a team.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that with scenario practice as a group exercise or a collective or community exercise. I'd love, so I know you've shared this story with me before, but when did you discover that your own imagination or the imagination of other people was a really powerful thing, like a moment when you realized that it could actually change people's presence?
Well, I know when stories began to be important to me as a child. Looking back on it, I was aware at the time that it was important, but I couldn't articulate it. So this is articulation now of what was going on when I was 5 years old. Because my father was captured as he was captured as a forward observer on D-Day +6 and spent most of his time in a prisoner of war camp in Poland. So when the Korean War broke out, he felt he hadn't done his duty to his country. So he quit his job and he signed up to go to Korea, and he left his wife and his three children, one just born, with his parents, my grandparents. Now, my grandmother had received a letter during the war saying that her oldest son was missing in action, presumed dead. So when he went off to Korea, she thought she couldn't be lucky twice, and she was extremely depressed. My mother, who was an uneducated and very devout Christian, prayed, and God told her he would come back. And I was 5 years old, and I was desperate to know, will he come back or won't he? Because here were these two most powerful figures in my life, and they were telling different stories about the future. And it took me a long time to realize neither of them knew, but the story they were telling about the future created the way they were being in the present. One was happy, one was unhappy. Why? The story they were telling about the future. And then I began looking to see, for the rest of my life, I've noticed how we are really, as Marty Seligman wrote in his book, Homo prospectus. We are not Homo sapiens, we're not wise, but we are the species that tells stories about the future. And it's the stories we tell that have helped us become the dominant species. Um, but we can tell better stories about the future than we tend to tell.
It's so interesting. I want to pick up on the thing you just said, which is about how the stories we tell have helped us become the dominant species. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, I think anthropologists know this, and most people know it in a way from popular anthropology, but we can coordinate better than any species because we can tell stories and language about what we want to do in the future that may be different from instinct, like the other animals, or what we've done in the past. And that's where imagination comes in. We can tell a story together about a new thing to do in the future that we've never done before. And most animals don't have, they can solve problems, which might require some ingenuity. But getting together and imagining a future together, that's a human capacity that's allowed us to do incredible things.
Right. And I want to turn from here to scenario planning as well, because you came to scenarios from literature rather than strategy. And you came to scenarios at a time when the field was fairly young, right?
Yes.
I wanted to know what did a literature training and career let you see or bring to light when you joined Shell that, the sort of numbers guys and the projections alone didn't?
Well, one thing is that stories need to be told in a way that's memorable, especially for busy CEOs. Anybody who's busy doesn't have time to read reports. And you can work a long time and write beautiful scenarios, but you better know that they're not really going to be read like War and Peace or great literature. And because of that, what I learned from poetry, which is how to do pithy, imagistic titles and how to divide something up into stanzas almost, and then label them in a way that if you just read the labels, you could tell the story yourself. So if you make the architecture of the story memorable enough, then executives could go around telling the story in their own words. So that was really what I learned from literature that helped me in scenario building.
Wow. So it was the architecture, the sort of bones of the story or the myth, um, even more than the individual sentences or words. Because, we often think about storytelling as, word to word to word, just kind of this linear flow. But really, you're talking about a shape.
Yes, and children know this. I mean, all you have to do is say, once upon a time, that's a trigger thing, okay, now I'm listening. And then you say, and then pause. Okay, is it the witch? Is it what is going to pop up? So there are ways to tell stories that engage the audience, and movie makers know how to do this. One reason that we filmed The Power of Myth at George Lucas Skywalker Ranch, he invited us there, is because he knew about the power of the hero tale and certain structures of stories that have a momentum of their own.
Sure. Um, I also wanted to know sort of when you first joined Shell, just kind of casting back, what was it like and how has that changed? Has the way you do scenarios or the way clients create or receive or are receptive to scenarios changed over time, or has it been relatively steady? And I think the question beneath this that a lot of us have is when you get a busy CEO or a busy executive, how do you get them to take the power of stories seriously? How do you get them to really engage with the practice of building a scenario, of storytelling, of sort of getting away from numbers and projections or getting away from predictions and exploring this space with you?
It's a difficult challenge in general. Not, it wasn't at Shell because they had, when I got there in the early 90s, they had profited greatly through practicing the future in advance. So with the oil crisis in the 70s, they were able to pivot very quickly because they had practiced their strategy. They had wind tunneled their strategy in each of the three different scenarios they had built. So they were already attuned to scenarios as a device within which to have strategic conversations, not as a device in which to predict the future. But over the years, it's really changed. And I should add quickly that I was never an employee of Shell. I always came in as a consultant to help create the stories. At the end of the 3 year, they did it every 3 years. At the end of the 3 year, I guess you'd say, gathering of information. So, what happens when people get used to talking about their strategy in the context of the future and an imagined future is that things pop up that you wouldn't expect. And while I was not in on the strategy discussions at Shell, our head guy was, and you can always see when a little story element gets played out in a conversation. But one of the things that makes scenarios difficult to, I guess you'd say, defend in advance is that you cannot ever point to a cause effect relationship that's really clear. You cannot prove that because they rehearsed this future when something like it, and always the future is never what you imagine, it's always different. When something like it shows up, that it made a difference they had thought about the future in a flexible way. Those are things that can't be proved. So valuing scenarios is to value the dialogue, the strategic dialogue that takes place, you could say, with scenarios as a foundation.
Can you give an example of that strategic dialogue? I mean, I love the direction that this is taking. Um,
Well, the quickest one I can give, which I wrote about in the book because it was quick. Usually these things are too complicated too complicated to really summarize briefly. But um, I was chairman of the board of our local public television station. We were looking for a new manager, and usually when you do that in the United States with a public television station, you go to the station just slightly bigger than you are. In our case, in Austin, Texas, it was San Diego. So you look for the assistant station manager, the second person in charge, and try to hire that person away to be your station manager. So we did a little scenario exercise over lunch with the board, really just with the executive committee, and said, okay, what do we want to be in the future? Do we want to go back to our roots as an educational television station, or do we want to do something different and be the public square for the Austin community? And the longer we talked about what it would might look like to be the public square for the Austin community, we thought, well, if we hire a director, maybe we don't need a TV person. Maybe we need a community builder. So we ended up hiring someone who had no television experience at all, but who had been the chief of staff for the governor. So someone we
Wow.
hadn't even been thinking about, even though she was one of my best friends. So
Right. So it opens up sort of different windows
yes,
of mind.
yes.
That reminds me a lot of causal layered analysis. I don't know if you've
Uh-huh.
seen Sohail and Ayatollah's work, but it's very much kind of like peeling away the layers until you get to the animating myth or metaphor. And then
Yes.
sometimes you change the metaphor in order to produce a different result. And that sounds like it's very much what you did, right? What if we were the public square?
I had a good friend who was CEO of the Meredith Corporation, and he and then I helped him with his first book of poetry. And he said, when you change the metaphor, you change the world. And so the metaphor when he came into the company was a football game, different sides, sort of, kind of like war. And he changed it to a marching band metaphor, where the idea was people playing in harmony. And it changed the culture. It just changed the culture. So, yes, you change the metaphor, you change the world.
I love that. And did you ever hear how he sort of went about spreading that metaphor? Because I've been in the room a lot of times when the metaphor does get changed, and then the question becomes, how do you implement it?
Well, that's where scenarios are helpful because I always try to use the metaphor throughout the scenario in a, I hope, subtle way, but it gets embedded in the story of the future. And then it begins to shape how you're seeing the present.
Right. And scenarios sound, when I've used scenarios, it's been a way to, as you say, start a dialogue, but also start a whole conversation, not just two, but a sort of culture-wide or company-wide or
Yeah.
organization-wide conversation that you can always circle back to those scenario sets.
And sometimes you can use, especially when I work with Adam on in other countries or where there's a difficult situation, like the future of the drugs problem in the hemisphere, the American hemisphere. Sometimes you can actually bring the metaphor into concrete reality because what we did the first night was ask everyone who was coming from every country in the hemisphere to bring us something that to them represented the drug problem and tell the story of why they brought that object that they put on a central table. It was very moving. By the end of that evening, the first evening, we had this table of objects that had so much power and meaning, and each of them contained within themselves a story. So there were stories already in the room that informed the scenarios we began to tell.
Wow. So you never come in thinking, this is the procedure that I'm going to do. Do you kind of let it unfold when you get in a room with a group of people? How do you go about starting to construct scenarios with
Well, you've done a lot of work in advance, interviewing the people who've asked you to do scenarios in the first place, usually the leaders, and you see what's on their mind. And for leaders who are, you know, well, they wouldn't be leaders if they weren't already coming up with solutions. So building scenarios is to some extent interfering with the sometimes unconsciously held story of the future that the leadership has. So the first thing I try to do is what are you concerned about? What would you like to know if you could know anything about the future? And what do you think the future probably will include? And then you see what the story is that might be in the way of hearing something different, but which also has to be taken into account because the story of the future is the reality that people assume. And you can't dismiss reality or people won't pay attention to the scenario. So somehow that official future has to figure in there somewhere.
and do you find that there is what kind of shape does the official future, that kind of official future take, that reality that's getting in the way? Um, and does it ever make it into the scenarios? Does it become a scenario? Does it get set aside? How do you engage with that story?
Depends on how strong it is. Sometimes I build what's called business as usual scenario. What if we kept doing what we're doing? And And that's usually if I have three scenarios, because it's not, it can be helpful. It's not something you want to aspire to usually, but it's good to take it on board sometimes.
Right.
Usually the official future is some kind of extrapolation from the past. So it's like, this is going to continue, maybe with a little change here, maybe with a little change there. Maybe there'll be in a fork in the road, depending on who chooses what. The fork in the road type scenarios can be a little misleading. I found when I worked a lot with the US government in the military and the intelligence people, they were very, what can I say? They really wanted a fork in the road so they could choose the most plausible fork, which is not really the way that at least scenarios in business usually work. And I think it's usually because people don't have time or think they don't have time to do the kind of open-ended discussion that a true scenario dialogue requires.
So when you're talking about a fork in the road, were you thinking about like a yes, no, you know, what if this happens versus what if it doesn't happen?
Well, it's like something happens and it either goes this way or that way. Which way is most plausible? Okay, that way. Let's plan mostly for that way.
Okay, so they were trying to get to a prediction,
Yes.
which is
In short, that's
okay.
what everyone wants. Everyone wants to know. That's
Yeah,
really what people want. There's no way to get around that. If you're doing scenarios underneath, people really want to know what is the future going to be.
yes, they do. They do. And how do you dance with that? Do you surface that? Do you say, "Hey, I know y'all want to know what the future is, but I can't tell you."
Not in so many words. What they do often is model
Mhm.
the future. And if you do modeling, and this is it's kind of a slippery slope because modeling always takes the present and projects it into the future. That's the nature of models. So if you do that, you have to, as a scenario writer, you have to sort of intervene in the model and say, well, in this scenario, maybe that thing is tweaked here, and maybe that thing is tweaked there. So you have to really get close to the modelers, which for a poetry professor, it's not my most comfortable place to be, you know. But it's models are very powerful because they just it's sausage it just churns it out and it's very compelling to have a model based on a scenario, but it does often confine the future.
And what do we lose when it confines the future?
Well, we lose an imaginative possibility that might otherwise be there.
Mhm. So something that the model couldn't have predicted,
Right.
right? Absolutely. So I want to talk about myths as well, since you've done so much thinking about myths. Uh, I know that you've done some writing about five types of myths, and economic, ecological, scientific, religious, and heroic. Um, so I'm just wondering, like, if you were, and that was about what, 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that.
Well, I have a contract for a book called Democracy, Gender, and the Economic Myth, which
Ooh,
is kind of updating them and bringing them into play in terms of the future of politics and democracy in Western democracies, and specifically the United States, which I know best, of course.
right. Well, I was going to ask you to maybe update them a little bit and bring them into play.
Yeah, because, and by myths, I don't mean something untrue. I mean a big story that we take for granted that's a cultural story of reality.
Yes.
And the economic, so-called, what I've called it for many years, the economic myth, that's the story of reality. It's the first truly global myth because it doesn't have a language barrier. Its medium is pictures and numbers. So it can be, and so it can work. All these myths have, good points and bad points, but the economic myth is breaking down at this point slightly as a way to hold the world together. And so whenever there's a breakdown, there's an opportunity. But that's when I say that the ecological myth is emerging. And by that, I don't mean necessarily environmental, although that's part of it, but a recognition that we're all interconnected. not a kumbaya, but everything is interconnected. So if you see that, what are the implications? So that it's a myth of health rather than growth. Although health does include growth. Growth is part of health, but it's a different value system. And I see little bits and pieces of that emerging. For example, a number of countries recently have instituted, I guess you'd say, procedures whereby every time they pass a law, they have to think about its effects on future generations.
Right, like in Wales.
Yes, and Jane, my friend Jane, was she did that, and she and Katerina Tully of the School of International Futures were worked very hard to have a version of that passed, a Declaration for Future Generations in the UN this October. So that myth is, I guess I could say I'm trying to make that happen in my little way. It takes a gazillion things to happen in people to push something forward, but it seems to be that's a desirable future to understand our interconnectedness and then what flows from that.
Yes. So is if we have the economic myth breaking down, which I think most of us can feel like really viscerally at
Yeah.
the time, is the answer to let it die and change the economic
Oh,
myth,
no.
or do or do we replace it, as you said, with an ecological myth? What
No,
happens?
all these myths still are in operation. They don't get replaced. It's just another myth becomes more powerful. And all of them have very good points. For example, the religious myth, and again, I have to emphasize, I don't mean something untrue, but it posits a value system above individual power or the power. And so if you are operating within a religious myth, even if no one's watching, you try to do the right thing. That's a step forward for humankind. The scientific myth, again, it's looking for truth. And we were lucky in the United States that we were founded under that Enlightenment myth because it meant for the first time it was a government under law and not of human beings. So that's a step forward, flawed though everything is, as because we're human.
Yep, for sure. Are there any sort of new myths that have come up? And I'm thinking specifically of technology here and how inevitable sometimes AI feels. Sometimes it feels like we have no choice except to kind of let AI steamroll us and then see what's left.
I'm trying to deal with AI. I was asked to help write scenarios for the future of AI, and then the group just gave up, at least for the time being, because it's just this was like 2 years ago, and it's developed so fast that it's outstripping imagination. I mean, each new thing comes on. The thing about AI is that it is, I don't want to say pretending, it is an amalgamation of the human and it can perform things like it can perform empathy in a more, what can I say, perfect way than human beings because it comes with no baggage. It doesn't get insulted. You can talk with it and tell it your troubles, and it will always give you a positive, unlike your partner or something. So there's something very enticing about the simulacrum of humanity that AI is. And what are we human beings going to do about that? I think we're at a real tipping point. I don't have an apocalyptic vision of the future, but I don't have it's automatically going to be great either. And what are we going to do about the meaning we found in work? What are we going to we really have to think together about the future. It's not it's not just for shell anymore. It's really for human beings to think about the future in a very conscious way.
Yeah, absolutely. I I loved what you said because it rang true about the sort of the pace of change outstripping even the ability to have scenarios about it and
Yeah.
then create that discussion. Because I think a lot of us are probably finding that. I'm definitely finding that anytime you introduce AI into it, you have to produce a scenario now because any discussion that you have is going to be superseded within a few weeks by something else. So how can scenarios even evolve? How can we do we need to slow down? How do we have those discussions when things are moving so fast? Those discussions that we need to have. And how can scenarios kind of be involved in that?
Oh, I think scenarios are automatically going to be involved in writing first drafts of scenarios and also capturing content of conversations.
Mhm.
Not so much perhaps what can I say? The subtle things you notice when you're dealing with a group. Like whenever something is brought up, like legalizing marijuana, I'm just harking back to the drugs, you know, that the general in charge of the drug war in Mexico might turn slightly. You just notice the body language of human beings in scenario groups that make you think, okay, something else, you have to take something into consideration here. Well, an AI, even if it's been programmed to do a kind of one-to-one, okay, when you turn away, you don't like it as much, even if it's programmed to interpret that, it's not going to get these subtle ways we have to communicate with each other, our feelings. And so, what is the desirable future we want? That's not going to, AI, I don't know that AI can tell us that. It might help us say, this would be better for you to eat your vegetables or whatever. But I'm not sure it can really do the thing we need to do to go forward together.
Yeah.
But it's early days. It's early days. But certainly AI is going to definitely be there in foresight work, no question.
So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that humans are still necessary to the system because they notice what makes things relevant to the people who are the scenarios are being created for, and what questions that those people have, what tensions those people have, and are going to need to be resolved or addressed in the scenarios.
Yes. And imagination makes leaps that AI tends it can look like it makes leaps because it's so smart,
Mhm.
but it tends to be predictive in a linear way.
Right.
And
It's absolutely predictive. Yeah.
yeah, so at least I understand that's how it works. But
So
again,
interesting.
you're talking to someone whose expertise is poetry. So
So
take
is
it with
mine.
a
I
grain of
came from
salt.
poetry as well. So
Oh,
I get it. I get it. I want to go back to process as well because you've had so much experience doing scenarios over time. So I asked a little bit earlier about how you go about it, and you said, well, you ask a lot of questions first, so you know how to kind of setting. So you've got people in a room, you've picked who it is. Where do you go next? What
it
happens?
depends. It
Huh?
depends. It depends on how much time you have. It depends on what would be most helpful. It depends on the dynamics. A good scenario coordinator is also a very, very good with groups and is able not to go down, okay, now we do A, now we do B, this is my procedure, but to see where the life is and to go with that.
Wow. And how do you do that?
Well, yeah, it's kind of I guess it's kind of like raising children in a way. You notice what they love, you notice what captures their attention, you notice where the tensions are in the room, um, you notice where the openings are for moving the next step, moving the whole dialogue forward. So that's
So you're noticing what makes that group unique at that moment in time and what makes it a group.
yes, because it's the group that's going to make the thing go forward or not.
Mhm.
Even if they're meeting, the only time they'll meet together, they'll go back to their home countries or whatever, and that will influence the dialogues they lead there.
Yep. Yep. So I do want to get to folks' questions because I know they will have them. But my last question is kind of what with all that we've talked about and with everything you've sort of seen in your work and in your life, what makes you hopeful? And what do you think it's going to take for us to realize that hope?
People like you, I'm not being flattering. There's so much interest in this. There's so much goodwill. There is so much desire to make the world, to leave the world a better place. There's so much unselfish helping of each other that I observe every day. I I'm I don't know, I believe in human beings.
Yep, I do too. And I'm so glad that you're joining us here because I feel like it's groups like this as well. You know, this group exists so that we can maintain a global dialogue at a time when there's so much regionalizing going on. And it's
Uh,
not easy for us. Some of us are
yes.
joining from 3 a.m. in Istanbul. I know, Bashir.
Is there
Uh,
someone here from Istanbul, that beautiful city?
oh, yes, there is.
Oh my gosh, what a beautiful
An
city.
early good morning, ma'am.
Oh my word. Gosh, Istanbul is so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite cities. So I'd like to open the floor. Who would you like to raise your hand? How do you usually go about this, Cece? I haven't been doing this for a few months.
Yeah, so they just raise their hands and they also can pose questions on the chat so that we can.
Okay, for sure. However you're most comfortable, just type it into the chat and we'll read it out, or jump in, or raise your hand, and we will see you.
While the questions are collecting, let me tell a story that has to do with this human thing. Um, I was doing scenarios for the future of the US-China relationship during a very tense time, which is a lot of tense lately. But it was mostly military guys. All the Chinese guys could speak English. All the English Americans could speak Chinese. So they had at it. But at the dinner the first night, one of the Chinese women was trying to sing a song and she didn't know the words, but an American soldier knew the words to this Chinese love song, stood up and sang it with her. And the two of them singing this Chinese love song together in Chinese, it did something to the group because it was sort of like, why are we talking about a future war between China and the US if if you can sing a love song with each other, you know, in that language. It's so that's just a story about what gives me hope.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I think there's a Celtic saying, don't give a man a sword until you teach him to dance.
Ha ha, I like that. I hadn't heard that.
So we have a question from Stephen. So Betty Sue, do you think the future of imagination will be globally plural, or are we moving towards increasingly homogenized futures shaped by tech platforms, markets, and geopolitical power? I think of the Lego video shorts produced mocking Trump's war in Iran as a sign of that plurality. And Stephen, if you want to jump in and say something, please feel free. Otherwise, Betty Sue.
Well, in a way, you could say it either way. You could say plurality because the Iranians are using Legos, but you could also say a global thing about Legos. So I think it's going to be both. I think that we will globally know, but I hope we'll not lose the individuality of these precious, wonderful, rich cultures. I don't want I don't want Istanbul to be like Chicago. I I just don't. I like Chicago. I like Istanbul. I want them to be different. So the appreciation of difference, and at the same time, this I think AI is almost inevitable that there's some kind of moving towards some kind of sameness when it comes to scraping the internet, because that's how it learns. So I don't know. That's not a good answer because it's kind of this and this, but it's how I see the future at the moment.
Great. I'm just going to call the folks I see, and please, if anyone sees hands that are not in my view screen, please let me know. Kelly, you have a question?
Thanks, Lavonne, and thank you so much, Betty Sue. This is so inspiring. Really have been looking forward to this. And my question actually relates to your book, Presence. I read it when I was in grad school. I found it so moving, especially thinking of that internal shift and transformation that's critical. And so it sounded like that moment you described with the love song. It's like that group
Yes.
felt that shift in the room, and it's like a very human thing to experience. And I had a quote from this book where you wrote, "Many visions are doomed from the outset because those who articulate them, whether consciously or not, are coming from a place of powerlessness. If we believe that someone else has created our present reality, what is the basis for believing that we can create a different reality in the future?" So I was just curious if you could share a bit more about helping groups or individuals find their power or their agency through this work, and if you've ever had to step away because the group hasn't been able to find their power to shape it or influence it.
Mostly when you work with groups, they've been selected and they're kind of powerful to start with. So it's not so much something I've observed in scenario groups, but individually, there's been a recent article published in a journal, a psychology journal, and it was a study done by 10 different researchers in 8 different universities in the US about what happens when a person can tell their life story as a hero story. Just teaching someone, that hero
Yeah,
doesn't,
yeah.
yeah, just teaching someone to see their life that way gives them, and they do these, psychology tests, they do these tests, gives them a greater sense of agency. So it's teachable, even if so much of what, it's out of our hands, what goes on, often government things, and the rain rains on the days it wants to rain. We don't really, so forth.
Yeah.
But the hero myth, that archetype, you have agency within. It's like you have a destiny within your fate. You can do some. I often, when I do workshops of all sorts, I have people, I divide them into groups of 2, and you can try this. It's a really amazing kind of thing. And I have person A tell their life story in 5 minutes to person B, usually they're strangers, as a victim story. And then person B, I say stop, and person B tells as a victim story. And then I say as a hero story. And so it's the same facts in a way, but
Yeah.
it's the plot that's in our hands, not the facts, where you were born, what we don't have
Mm.
control over those, but the way we tell the story. And we can help each other tell better stories. And they're
Thank
just as
you. That's
true.
beautiful.
Yeah, they're just as true as the negative stories. There are also studies that have shown, especially, all these studies are done on college kids for good and for ill. So I just say that. But students, if they're given like a critique of a painting by a critic, like a paragraph, and if one group is given a paragraph that's negative, the other group is given a paragraph that's positive, using somewhat same words but putting not where they're, so they're equally, the critiques are equally smart, if you will. Inevitably, the negative critique will be judged to be written by a smarter person than the
Oh,
positive
wow.
one. That research has been repeated. So if we think that a negative view is somehow smarter or more realistic, then we tend to believe that, as opposed to someone saying, well, I see some good things coming out of this, all right? So people learn to be, what can I say, cynical in order to look smart. That's
Wow.
just human nature, because we've learned, we survive by saying, oh, there's probably a tiger under that bush, you know.
Yeah.
Yep, negative
Super
bias.
interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Yaron, you had a question?
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much, Lavonne and Anisah, for organizing this, and thank you, Betty, for the very interesting talk about scenarios. So my question is more about scenarios per se, and the art of like actually developing, let's say, signals to scenarios. In my specific case, I have a newsletter where I'm tracking signals from the future of information, intelligence, and decision making. It's pretty broad, it's across sectors, and every now and then I stop and I'm like, what if I could actually use a few of these signals to create an interesting scenario? I'm not sure what's the best way to do this. It's very easy to do with one signal when you create, let's say, a futures wheel or something like this, and you just develop it. But what if you wanted to, let's say, combine a few and just go about it pretty freely and intuitively, not anything fancy? What would be your advice for this?
Well, if I had a Substack or a website or something like that, which I don't, but if I did, I would invite people. I'd give them these prompts. I'd give them a little bit that comes from your imagination, and I would invite people to make up parts of the story. I think you would
Oh,
get people doing that and even invite artists. And certainly AI can help with, it's called AI slop, but it can be pretty good. These illustrations. And you could have these snippets of futures create crowdsourced that would be very interesting then to run AI over and say, write something using these snippets and all, and do it in real time, have people watching this process. That's what I would do if I had a platform and where AI as probably as media literate as you are. I don't know.
Thank you
Is
so
that
much.
what you were asking?
Yes, because here's the thing, it's very one-sided right now. I'm pretty much writing things. Sometimes I use AI maybe to kind of like develop a few consequences, but it's not pretty much a dialogue. One way I'm working to solve this problem is to actually invite people who work in very interesting companies to kind of like tell me their story and what they think the future could look like from where they stand. And yeah, that could be maybe the beginning. Maybe I'll try to do something more collaborative
I think that would be
moving
fun.
forward. Yeah,
Why don't you put in the chat, put your how we can look at whatever it is you're doing. Put that
absolutely. Yeah.
put that in the chat so we can follow through, those of us who are interested.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Betty.
Thank
Sue.
you so much.
We have a question from Yelena. A question to Betty as a literature professor. What was the most difficult thing in adjusting to working with Shell's business people, who in general may lack imagination? Where did you
Well,
find that?
I didn't find that. I'll tell a funny story. My first set of scenarios, I put a poem on the cover, Cavafy poem about the barbarians. Some of you may know it. About what are we, this is after the fall of the Berlin Wall and, the fall of the Soviet Union. This is 1992. So I put this, what are we going to do if we don't have an enemy? So I put that, but I didn't put it in Greek. I put a good translation of it on there. So I got criticized for not putting it in Greek. And so I was given a copy of it in Greek as a going away present. I was laughing at it as I was going down the hall, and the boss came up. He was coming the other direction. He says, "Betty Sue, what are you laughing at?" And I said, "Oh, look, Tim gave me this going away present, the Cavafy poem that I put. He's given it to me in the original Greek." And by gosh, this guy started reading the Greek in Greek. So I thought, oh my gosh, I'm out of my depth here. I could walk down the hall of the English department and nobody would just read what I'm carrying in Greek. That was when they hired Oxford, Cambridge people who walked around barefoot in the halls and ate long lunches with sherry and all. Everything's changed at Shell. They got McKinsey in, and now it's got a CEO. It's more Americanized in that way. But
No more Greek.
I don't think so. I don't think so. But anyway, when I started, it was not an adjustment at all, except kind of shocking. Like, they would take me to lunch in the British Museum and show me the silver hoard that they had dug up. That was one lunch.
Wow.
I mean, it was just a different culture in those days.
That must have been some lunch.
It was some lunch.
Bashir, you have a question.
Thank you very much, Lavonne. And once again, Betty Sue, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful uh, ideas, expertise, lessons learned, life experiences. My question is, are the scenarios safest mode for executives to build trust and open gateways, otherwise that wouldn't open? And what do they, I guess in a way, it's kind of like an executive retreat, but instead of being out in the wilderness or in a remote area, you're really keeping it in their office. And thank you very much on keeping the identities of cities. My introduction to future studies was the Epcot Center. So I was studying law and I was very happy to study law, but then once I went for a holiday and the Epcot Center, this is not what I wanted. So thank you.
I saw it the week it was opened. It was pretty amazing. In the day, now, gosh, but in the day, it was very, very amazing. Yeah, yeah.
So was your question about the role of scenarios in trust building?
In trust building, what does it, I mean, when you see it, it means of change as to how it affects the executives and what are their feedback typically?
I think
What
it
do they
does.
tell you in private, rather?
I've had a lot of private conversations, but one of the things that a scenario process does, especially if there are a lot of people involved and it takes a while, I do not work on Google Docs or any shared documents. I have people send them individually because sometimes people who are not as high up as the CEO or whoever will not say the real thing they want to say in a group, but they'll put it on a marginal comment. And I take every marginal comment on board one way or another and create a dialogue in footnotes until every footnote is settled. So there's a way in which the writing process, going through many drafts, allows the introverts and the people lower on the totem pole to speak up forcefully sometimes. And so there are those little, it's tradecraft, as the CIA would put it in that regard. Yeah.
Getting everybody to share their opinion and then incorporating it. Julie, you had a question.
Yeah, mine is just kind of quick. Betty Sue, thanks so much for being here tonight. Um, a lot of us try really hard, especially American-based folks, Western folks, to get out of our technical reading and kind of our that side of our brain and really try to focus on other types of sensing and knowing. And I often lean on poetry and recommend that to folks. And so just kind of one of the beautiful parts about evenings like this is getting to know who the speakers are beyond just like what they do for work and in their professional life. And so I wonder if maybe you'll just share with us either a couple of poets that you really love or a book of poetry for those of us that are interested.
I have so many favorite poets. We could be here all night. But I'll tell a story of doing some foresight work in Ireland, in Dublin, with some bankers. And all these bankers sitting around a table, they said, "Who's your favorite poet?" I said, "Well, Yeats is among my favorites," which is true. They all in unison began reciting the Lake Isle of Innisfree. In unison, these bankers. It was just wonderful. So I do love I love all the old, Shakespeare, Yeats, Dickinson. I like all those. And I like some of the Christian Wyman, and I like a lot of the modern gosh, there's very few poets I don't I don't appreciate in some way or another. So you can just go online to the Poetry Center or the Poem a Day. You can discover a lot, both ancient poems and modern poems. Poem a Day. I used to have the privilege of judging the poetry contest every year for the Library of Congress Poetry Prize. So around this very messy, this is a fake background because I don't have any spare room in my bookshelves. They're full of poetry books from all the poetry prizes I've judged, even though I've given them most of them away, just piled up. So poetry is wonderful and discovering new poets is wonderful. So I know that doesn't answer your question, but you can go online and say, give me a poem about water and the color blue, and something will come up. Anything. You can say anything.
We have another question from the chat. So in scenario work, are there ways that certain forms of imagination that involve control, conquest, competition, disruption still dominate over more relational, more embodied, or more care-centered ways of imagining? And my understanding of this question, and please hop in to correct me, is it does the creation of scenarios, is it easier to kind of go down the sort of road of war versus imagine the care-centered ways or the relational ways of unrolling the future?
Oh, yes. It's always easier to imagine conflict than to imagine how to solve problems.
Why is that?
Why is it?
Yeah.
Because we think in binaries. We think, black and white, male and female. We think in binaries, and then we put the binaries up against each other. Our judge one is better than the other. I think the first sin in the Garden of Eden was not disobedience, what they discovered. It was good and evil, was labeling things. And the first thing they did was cover up the parts of their bodies that showed difference. So, that's the first, that's that's the fall in the Garden of Eden, is judging difference and feeling we have to judge one thing better than another and making that, uh, just it's not necessary. We can figure out how to use all kinds of things together. And as long as if we look at what all the religious myths teach, which has to do with kindness and doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, or do not do. I mean, Judaism, Confucianism, Christianity, they all have those kinds of kind behaviors at the heart of them. But it's just so much more exciting to fight.
In some ways, it's easier too.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, much.
So I know you've been thinking a lot about the possible futures of democracy globally. Could you just tell us a little bit about the Athena Project, and then and talk about why it's a good time to do that now, and what it has to do with imagination?
Well, it's just a fun way to get some really amazing women together under the aegis that I came up with this idea at the School of International Futures last summer with a Greek parliamentarian. And I was thinking of Athena, and I thought, so many things have been seen from the perspective of necessary dominance and not necessary care. And as long as we're making binaries of things, women have been associated with care, who wants your son to die in war, and men have been associated with dominance. Again, it's not to do with individual men and women, but what might be called uh, a female imagination, if you could see that not as a gender thing and not a sex thing. So I was thinking, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote the Declaration of Human Rights, and a female in the U.S. in Roosevelt's cabinet, Frances Perkins, invented Social Security. And there's Jane with her in Wales with her Declaration for Future Generations, and Christine Figueroa with the Paris thing that she worked on for years. And okay, let's just get some, from a female perspective, get some women to, how would we imagine if women were inventing democracy? How might it be different? It might not be. I don't know. But it's at least it's a discussion from a female, that is to say, the taking care of in community perspective. Again, I don't want to, it's not a division between men and women. It's a way of thinking out of, as long as we generally think in one part of the binary, we don't think in the other. And this is specifically geared toward the US. I mean, because I'm an American citizen, and I'm in the board of the American Councils for International Education. We've had to scrape during Doge days, we had to scrape our website of anything to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, women. So it seemed apt to think from the part that has been excluded recently.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of work for the East West Center, and they've also they changed their Equitable Futures Fellowship to the Sustainable Futures Fellowship, and even that felt risky.
No, yeah. In fact, our CEO has made a bot to represent the State Department in its current iteration. So she runs all her speeches through the bot, who'll say, maybe you want to change this word here and that word. I mean, it's out of 1984, but this too shall pass. So.
And you talked about the opportunity that's contained in the breakdown of the current systems. Yes. Is that sort of why the Athena Project is now?
Yes, absolutely. We need imagination. And when things look bad and there's destruction, there's opportunity.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, Betty Sue. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a huge honor to have you amongst us.
It's my honor to be here. Thanks to everybody for coming.
Thank you everyone for sharing our digital campfire just to talk about stories and myths and imagination. Please join our Future Studies channel Substack if you like what you heard. We'll put it in the chat. SeeSee, are you able to do that? Otherwise, I can. Oh, there we go. You got it from two directions at once. It was so nice to see everyone and to take this hour to gather from around the globe, with special appreciation to everyone who took time out of their lives and everyone who's dialing in from bed. All right. Until next month. Thanks, everyone. See you later.